some of you are already ahead of me here. I was going to say welcome and thank you so much for joining our session today on Gender Transformative Research Methods Toolkit. Many of you will have come to the meeting where we introduced the whole toolkit, and this is the first time that we're digging down on one tool. So the tool that we'll be digging down on today is the GALS for GTR method. So GALS, a well-known household methodology for GTR, so for gender transformative research. But before we begin, could you please pop in the chat your name, your organization, and where you're joining from today? So welcome everybody. Hi, Ilona, Victoria, Simone, Winnie, Kathy. So welcome everybody. Let's go on to the next slide, please, Ojong. So as I said, welcome, and we're talking about GALS for Gender Transformative Research. Can we go ahead? Okay, so today we're going to introduce this tool, the GALS for GTR, which is a household and community-led transformative tool. And oops. Got a bit of a little technical issue going on, but I'll just tell you what the objectives are today. So we're going to introduce the new tool, and we're going to look at how GALS addresses inequalities, shifts norms and attitudes, and how it can support communities in anticipating challenges and building networks. We're also going to look at gaps and opportunities to improve the tool. So if you're a research practitioner, or if you're working in communities, how can you use this tool and how can you improve it for your own situations to co-design gender transformative solutions? So the webinar speakers today are Tina Yap, who's a community development practitioner and also a student, PhD student at the University Kebinsang in Malaysia. And then we have Ojong Baa, who's at the International Water Management Institute, better known as IWMI, who's a gender researcher. And she's also one of the co-conveners of this community of practice. And Kathy Farnworth, who's an independent gender researcher and also one of the co-conveners of the community of practice on gender transformative research methodologies. So, first question to all of you online. Have you ever used GALS as a method before? So have you used this household method in your work? Yes, no, or not quite sure? Do you have some responses, Jessica?
Yeah, we do. 78% of people have responded. So perhaps I'll just give it 10 more seconds and then I'll show you the results.
Okay. Okay, so mainly no, a little yes, and also a little bit people not quite sure. Maybe they've used it, maybe they've used other household methodologies, but they're not quite sure. Okay. Kathy, would you like to tell us something about GALS and household methods in general?
Yes, thank you very much. And it's lovely to see you all at this webinar. And thank you for coming from so many different countries and organizations. Household, couple and family methodologies are a very intriguing bunch of methodologies. And they've become popular over the past, let's say, 15 years. And it's quite interesting that some of you said you might have worked with GALS, but you're not sure, because GALS now has mutated and there's many permutations of the GALS. There's also other household methodologies that are like the GALS. The GALS was not the first either, so they're gaining a lot of currency. Just to look at the picture on the left here, I just wanted actually just to have a picture of a typical house to illustrate this slide. And what really struck me was that every picture I looked at on the internet had a house with a closed door. And I think this is fundamental to household methodologies. It really is about the idea that how do we conceptualize a household? And for decades, I think the development sector conceptualized a household as a closed space in which you could not operate or work. And it was seen as a kind of almost a secret space. But we know that in reality, households are permeable, and that what happens in household influences how household members operate and act in the real world. And Amartya Sen in 1987 first created the concept of cooperative conflicts. And he argued that people work together, household members work together to bring things into the household, money and income and food and so on, into the household, but there's conflicts over how those benefits are distributed. And he looked at the equality of that kind of redistribution. Was it fair? And he talked a lot about the gender dimensions of that kind of cooperative conflict. Who does what, who benefits? These are the classic gender questions. So really, household methodologies were about opening that door and saying what happens in a household really matters for the ability of people to create their own development pathways and how communities operate. And many years ago, I looked at one of the first household methodologies in Zambia called the Agricultural Support Program, which was funded by Swedish CEDA, and it was incredibly successful. And I was meant to do an evaluation with a Zambian colleague. And two things happened. One is my colleague, Vincent Akmadisa, he said, I've never, ever encountered a more successful methodology. And he said he'd worked on women's issues and gender and development for a decade. But also in one village, I just remember talking to the women, and they said, if you only operate at the community level, nothing will change, because what really matters is what happens in the household and how discussions are conducted. So if you look at the right-hand side, this is the methodological space for household methodologies, creating power to empower. So I think we know the bottom left, power over refers to a situation where somebody is dominating other household members. It could be a senior man who dominates young people in the household and his wife. It could also be a woman, of course. This is why these pictures also show women. It's not necessarily the case that men always have power over women. But it just is a kind of unhealthy relationship where somebody's dominating other people. Then you've got power too, where people are able to exercise their agency. That's at the top left. And they have an outcome in mind. This is a classic definition of agency, and they get to the outcome that they want. And then at the top right, you have power within. People experience self-esteem and self-confidence, which is really the bedrock of empowerment. Unless you have that, it's really hard to move forward. Then you have power with. People share and act together towards a goal. And you will see as Ojong moves forward in her presentation, and Tina, that they will talk about the importance of power with, through joint visioning and the other ways that you work together to create your future in the household. On the veteran board, I have put up the names of 2 or 3 other household methodologies you might want to look at, and a couple of articles which have looked at the efficacy of household methodologies in real-world contexts. So thank you very much.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Katie, for introducing briefly what is GALS. Yeah, so I would like to start off with by, you know, by actually asking all of us here, do you know one of the major roadblocks as a in community development is not about merely surviving, it's not about learning or practicing language or even cultural immersion to learn the language, but it's more about embracing how the indigenous voice led while we myself as a community development practitioner trying or attempt to translate the narratives or hidden inequalities into community-owned transformation supported by evidence-based methodology. So, hi, my name is Tina. I'm a community development practitioner. I work in the rural areas back in Malaysia, particularly with a very specific tribe, indigenous people, particularly the Semai tribe. So, what GALS has been introduced by Katie. So I would like to actually inform you all that I actually have not tested the full GALS, but actually at least 50% of the GALS that I've actually incorporated in my practice with the indigenous people. But basically, it's more towards participatory tool. So what I'm sharing here is actually based on my experience, practice of implementing participatory tools, and what are the roadblocks that I face as a community development practitioner as well as a researcher myself. Okay, so if you look at it, one of it is actually when I listen to the oral storytelling, or even when I use participatory mapping. I'm referring to map drawn by the indigenous people, either by hand or even we use GPS. I think if you look at the picture here, I'm actually using GPS together with the indigenous people. They themselves been trained to use technology. Yeah. So in whatever form that I realize, this is one of the way that they express their experience. Yeah. So it actually helped me to understand the gender role distributions in a way that is least intrusive and also minimize the language barrier. Although the tribe that I'm working with, we talk the same language, but it may be differ because of the location. Unfortunately, I noticed the roadblock that I face as a practitioner, whether am I able to translate confidently based on the collated narratives, the stories, the oral stories that I gather in order to further in finding or even co-develop what are the gaps structurally, okay, which is part of my role to develop as well as to improve services, finding gap, including evidence-based research in order for me to understand truly what are the power dynamics that actually occur within the community, the indigenous people. For example, those people that I work with, the indigenous people in agriculture, I will look at, whether will I be able to understand what are the power dynamics when women farmers, they want to apply for microloan facility, but at the same time, they require men's or husband to come to agreement. Okay, so this is one of the roadblock. Whether am I confident enough to document the narrative to help me to understand what are the gap? How am I going to co-develop together structurally? Okay, and then the next is actually looking at the success metric. Okay, so I ponder what actually community-led success looks like. Do I know if the indigenous people, I use the word orang asli in my local language, we term it as orang asli, actually referring to the indigenous people in Peninsular Malaysia. So how do I know that the indigenous people, the orang asli, whether at households or even communities, they have been transformed? I often question what are the valuable measures that I want to see changes, particularly in gender dynamic. So for instance, looking at the community that I work with, the indigenous people, what are the hidden power, like how specific a sex group that dominate a certain types of crops that they can plant. Okay. And then the third point, roadblock that I would like to highlight is actually gender is abstract. Yeah, for the indigenous people. So for me as a practitioner, community development practitioner, as well as a blend of a researcher, how do I, as well as other colleagues, they themselves, they are indigenous people, how do I actually truly make the concept of gender relevant and practical? Yeah, it's not merely just introducing the awareness, but how do I make it practical and applicable? So for instance, to analyze the gender dynamics, what are the power relations that happen within the tribe, the household, or a specific village? Whether it's my current practice combined with development and research, I need to actually look into the deeply rooted concerns that matters to ensure that the impacts are sustainable, as well as the well-being of our Indigenous people are protected. Okay, so these are one of the roadblocks that I often question as a practitioner itself. And lastly, if you look at the other point at the bottom, site facilitation. Yeah, so often even the use of participatory tools back in my country, in my own practice, often they are facilitated by our own staff. So I'm referring to community development workers. They come from different backgrounds. Most often, these tools are facilitated by the staff themselves from my workplace. Okay, so apart from this, I also observe the roadblock having lack of community ownership. Yeah, this is what we want to, in community development, we want to actually make sure that whatever that we do is actually the community own it. They themselves felt sense of belonging. But at the same time, somehow there's a gap in between. I don't really see, there's a lack of or insufficient of community ownership, even to the extent that the Indigenous people that I work with, are they part of the leading or co-lead or even co-design at the design phase of the program or activity in the agriculture work? Sometimes it could be related to my own fear, of letting go. But at the same time, probably for myself, lack of how to build community ownership. So this is one of the roadblocks that I face. I often question, like, is there really truly community owned in whatever that I'm doing, as well as how do I actually work from here, from what am I doing now, how to actually build a community ownership. Yeah, whether you're combining community development as well as research, which is part of my role in my agency. Okay, so right now, I will also pass the time to Ojong to actually come in to explain the newly improved GALS.
Thanks so much, Tina, and thanks everyone for joining today. Like Tina said, and Kathy also reiterated, we've all experienced these challenges as research practitioners, for those who've used GALS or any other household methodology. I think the biggest or one of the problems we've encountered over time, personally for me, it's really been how do I translate, the knowledge I get from participants in the communities we work with into something meaningful for impact, but also how do we bring them into that process? And so over time, having used GALS as a tool, as a methodology, I struggled from a research perspective, really getting research into that tool. So what you'll be hearing today is really around a revised or modified version of GALS, which really brings in a strong research component. And we'll explain to you how we walk through this process as a team to redesigning GALS to integrate research as a key element for transformative change. So yes, aside it being a household and community-led transformative tool, GALS, supports or really promotes a co-design approach for visions and analysis. And this is what we wanted to really push through within the revised GALS for Gender Transformative Research. So what we wanted to do was have a space where communities or the participants we work with are able to support the co-design of the vision they want to see often we have communities come up with their visions, solutions, but this does not translate into the kind of research questions we ask before we go into the field. And so GALS for Gender Transformative Change really came from that perspective, where we wanted a co-design process that takes into consideration the voices of communities. But also we wanted the analysis not to be so complex, We wanted it to be a space where communities can also be part of the research analysis process, where they get to understand gender, power, and other inequalities in their own context, and how the analysis, reflects their reality on the ground. And also, GALS for Gender Transformative Change really supports, the work we do within food system more broadly. So around food security, sustainable income, growth, climate smart innovations, not just that, but innovations more broadly that are often scaled across different contexts. It uses GALS often as an enabling environment tool, right, that creates safe space for communities to talk about visions, but also propose solutions. When we saw this as a key tool for enabling environment or supporting enabling environment outcomes, we felt there was also a need for us to strengthen the research component around key impacts that we want to achieve or communities want to see in their context. But what was really important to us was how we're creating safe spaces within communities through dialogues, but also allowing space for them to be able to, in the process, design the kind of pathways that they want, and also scale innovations and impact following their perspectives. And so when we looked at GALS traditionally, as it's always been used, in the past, we felt there were 4 critical gaps we needed to close or address. And that's how GALS for Gender Transformative Research came through. These gaps were, gaps that picked on, key research aspects that we felt needed to become more robust within the current GALS process. And so originally you see that GALS as a methodology really lacked a structured research design. It had some sort of very limited evidence, generation that could support research and development programs. We also felt there was a research gap because conventional research will often show you that there's a weak integration of power, as an analysis and also social norm transformation. So while GALS would obviously, address issues around coming up with clear visions, thinking about solutions, but also thinking about the kind of networks you need to build. It didn't translate this into clear research focus, where as research practitioners, we could be able to say in the course of implementing GALS, here's how we can analyze power dynamics, here's how we can transform certain social norms. We also felt participation gap was an issue where we had limited community ownership in the co-creation process. So here I'm talking about the research co-creation process, where communities can be positioned also as researchers in this process, where data is being collected or sourced. And rather us just seeing them as objects in the field, we felt it was needed for them to be, brought into the process from the beginning. So that participation gap around research for co-creation was something we felt we needed to close. And then lastly, we felt there was an M&E gap. So the monitoring and evaluation gap here was really around how do we track transformation change around gender relations and power dynamics. While GALS typically would, help you or expose you to some of these gender relations and power dynamics, a clear methodology, a robust research tool around monitoring and evaluation that can help you track progress and transformation over time was really not so strongly integrated. And we felt that was something that GALS for Gender Transformative Change could strengthen. But how does this respond to research for development? Now we are talking about GALS for Gender Transformative Research. So there is GALS, which we typically use, and now we are trying to bring in the research component. And we feel this is going to help research for development also do research differently. So there's the development aspect, which we often do, but the research component, like we say, has been missing, and that's what we are trying to address. So for example, one aspect is really around the research research design. And what the current GALS tool does is that it adds structured research and analytical frameworks to GALS Foundation. This is something that has often been missing, and we felt we needed to give that structured pathway for researchers to be able to analyze using clear frameworks, but also build this within the GALS context or foundations that has been implemented, that has been structured already or programmed. We also felt gender and power can be better, improved if we embed systematic gender and power analysis to the process. And this we've done through research phases, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. We also brought in the co-design phase for research, where we believe genuinely participants or communities we work in can, own the process, but also drive sustainability through the kind of solutions that they are co-creating. And lastly, like I said, we brought in a very strong media focus. So here it's really around the monitoring, the evaluation, but also what are we learning from the communities? What are the impacts that we are generating from this research process? But what's important is how are we assessing all of this? And lastly, the A, which is now like an addition, is we do not want to end around assessing, but are we able to adapt and fit this back into our learning loop? And so these are the kind of additions we've been able to bring into the revised GALS tool. And for us, we believe that this is a way of really bringing communities as research practitioners within the empowerment space. And when we talk about the revised GALS tool, we followed 3 phases of participatory approach. The phase 1 for this is really a research co-design phase. And what this phase does is it sort of establishes, the research basics, the foundations through which participatory research can be done. So it brings in like the needs assessment, how to collectively think through problem analysis, how can stakeholder mapping be done within the intervention you're carrying out, but also how joint research can support communities to design what they want. So communities tend to define and prioritize their needs through the sort of research co-design methods that we introduce. And this is very important because, and we'll see this, I think, in our next slide, the first phase is really a core research foundation phase, which we are introducing. Ideally, GALS will go in to do some sort of gender, to understand gender issues, but it doesn't follow a structured research phase, which says, for example, a needs assessment, maybe in a climate-related context, brings in a research framework like your vulnerability needs assessment framework, And there are so many other frameworks which we've tried to integrate in this process, just so that research can be more robust within the use of GALS. The second phase is really like the implementation phase, and this phase doesn't change so much from the typical GALS steps, It follows the same 4 steps approach, but what we've tried to integrate is really an ability for you to generate data that can be backed with a research or a theoretical research focus. So we try to foster this through, empowerment approaches, but also how communities can be able to say the actions we are taking has evidence rooted within the research space as well. And then the last phase brings in, like I said, your participatory media approach, where communities work together with us to be able to co-create clear indicators, research-backed indicators that can allow them, not just as community members, but also to see the direction we as researchers we are taking and why we are taking those steps. So the adjustments happen across the different strategies that we pull through the different indicators that have been designed. So when we look at the 4 research steps, like I said, GALS typically will have like your vision journey, the gender balance tree, the challenge action tree, and then the social empowerment and networking. Those are typically like your 4 steps that we use for GALS when we implement GALS within an intervention. What we have done is to introduce, clear research steps that can help you generate data and analyze those data from a research perspective with communities. So for example, when you look at the first step, which is the vision journey, usually it will help you to think through around, as an individual or a household, what your aspirations are. But also what we've tried to bring in is to help communities and us researchers reveal vulnerability patterns, also establish some sort of what communities understand as their goals, but also what are those constraints, what's holding them back from, reaching their full potential. And what we've added here are some frameworks, and there are many more you can add to this list. We've just provided some examples here. When you are helping communities to, explore vulnerability, you could use insights from the Climate Vulnerability Assessment Framework. Here, the intention is that participants or communities are able to start identifying individual gaps, that they can build agency towards, but also where they need certain capacity skills. And that also comes back to us as research practitioners, where often we might be able to identify gaps, but we do not really know the action to take. And so the research approaches or methods we are introducing to this kind of give you that tailored approach to follow. Now, when you look at the second step, which is around the gender balance tree, it's really an approach which is very visual, like all the other steps for GALS. Helps you to unpack issues around gender division of labor, resource allocation, assets, decision making. What we are trying to add here as a research tool to this process is how can you embed clear research or gender, now I need to be specific, clear gender research methods and approaches that can help you come up with data and analysis. For example, when you're looking at gender division of labor, household patterns and whatnot, we have the MOSA framework, which typically would help you address issues around labor roles, the triple roles from individual, community and whatnot. MOSA framework here is going to help you unpack the division of labors that different communities or households might not really see at the beginning. But we also have the Harvard Analytical Framework. And what it does is that it helps you to understand resource access. Who has access to resources in the communities? How are those resources being accessed and for who and why? Now, you having these typical gender research approaches to be able to analyze can also be implemented or embedded within the gender balance tree, which already addresses issues around gender-based, division of labor, which often brings imbalances within the households and communities. And what this does is that it helps you to position clear actions around household negotiations. And it could go beyond household negotiations to how communities are able to negotiate across resources, but also, bring in access to those resources in cases where different regulations or laws might apply. And then when we look at the third step, which is really around the action tree, the challenge action tree brings together, like, you've understood the root causes, you have challenges around gender inequalities, but what are the root causes to those inequalities and barriers? And what sort of solutions can we think through? Usually that's what the GALS approach or step for challenge action tree would address. What we have tried to do is to move beyond, symptoms to how can you explore and analyze structural barriers? Why co-developing these with communities? So you have room, there's room for communities working with you to start saying the root cause of maybe labor patterns is because of 1, 2, 3. But how do we address this when we do not understand, the kind of solutions that researchers or implementing partners or development organizations bring to us? So what we've tried to introduce is a lens around the social ecological systems thinking. And this lens, and like I said, there are so many other gender frameworks and lenses you could bring into this, depending on your context and intervention. An example here is the social ecological systems thinking lens. What this does is it helps you to address, drivers of change. While communities might be very particular around drivers linked to environmental change, maybe climate and so many other factors, here as a gender researcher or practitioner, you have the opportunity to also explore social drivers or political drivers, giving you an opportunity to explore bundled drivers, but also solutions that can help communities you work with. And this way, your analysis, would help you come up with solutions that are not ad hoc, but also solutions that take a sort of holistic approach. And the last step is really around social empowerment and networking. Here, the aim is really to support communities, build stronger networks, build stronger relationships, while addressing, certain power dynamics that they might encounter. And some of the social networks within communities could be, how do you bring in maybe the police as a potential actor in supporting maybe the uptake of conservation agriculture, for example? How do you bring in grassroots organizations, in creating awareness around gender barriers and other drivers of change? How can you bring in the churches? How can you work with cooperatives? These are all different collective agencies that we believe communities need to understand their different roles, but also where they can start mapping power dynamics. For example, a traditional leader in a community would be working to support the communities, but power dynamics have shown us that the relationship is not equal, it's not even. Communities often cannot question, the authority of traditional leaders, but traditional leaders have the mandate, to establish certain rules and regulations in their communities. But what this exercise does is it gives from traditional leaders to different actors an opportunity to start seeing where those power dynamics are and how it impacts the same communities that they are trying to support and help them address certain dynamics. And so here, you can use maybe, for example, the social network analysis. That's typically a lens that we've used over time to explore, how communities or how actors within a network relate with one another, but also what are the likelihood that a particular actor's agenda could affect, the other agendas of actors within that network. And here, what we are trying to push is really how can you, strive for collective advocacy? Whose voice is being heard? Whose voice is being excluded? And what are those exclusionary norms that you could be, exploring at this pace with your different actors involved? And so, what we are trying to bring together in this GALS for Gender Transformative Research is that across each of these steps I've mentioned, you have the opportunity to generate data that can speak towards aspirations and vulnerability insights. And that really comes through for the first step on vision journey. You also have the ability to, generate data that speaks to gender inequality patterns as you identify them. You also have the ability to discuss your root causes and also map solutions. And then lastly, there's the opportunity for you to, unpack power, but also relationship dynamics that happens within the sphere in which you operate. What we've also added, which is really coming in strongly as sort of a new focus to GALS, is the Melia approach. Usually for GALS, we will commonly use the most significant change story as one of our strongest Melia points of analyzing change over time. While that's so good, it does not give us like clear indicators, where you can say, this is my starting point and here's my end point. And so we've brought in a more robust Melia approach, which speaks to how communities can track progress on self-selected indicators, but also what are they evaluating within these participatory assessment processes, what's effective, what's not working, what are the outcomes they are working towards. But also this is really a learning space. And so when we do GALS, say within a 12-month period, 6 months period, the aim we push is really how are people learning, but also sharing that learning with others. And GALS really takes a cascading approach where learning is being highly prioritized, reflections and knowledge sharing. The impact assessment comes with clear indications. And here we've tried to provide with a very structured approach. What sort of impact do you want to measure, or assess? So in terms of transformation, we've provided 3 clear indicators. Transformation around agency, around areas of impact assessment can be, clearly measured, and adjustments can happen based on the evidence that you generate. And so when you look at the Melia framework here, I spoke about 3 main dimensions. So we speak about agency, and here we've brought out sub-dimensions for agency. It could be around autonomy, decision-making, confidence, how our participants or the communities you work with build confidence over time, taking up leadership position, making decisions that work towards their good and empowering themselves. When we talk about power, we've brought out sub-dimensions as well, from hidden power to visible power to invisible power. These are different aspects that as a researcher could go in to explore and also analyze. We've also looked at institutions, but from a position of both formal and informal institutions. And here, the dimensions is really looking around, norms. Are there social norms, both formally and informally, that communities could, take or use as entry points or opportunities for them to build agency? But also, what are those exclusionary norms that stands as a barrier or a constraint to communities achieving their full potentials or visions that they've set out? So if you look at the diagram, what we've done is to, easily show you how this can be mapped. If you're exploring maybe autonomy, agency, like you see in blue, there are several other sub-dimensions you can pull from. When you are looking at power dimensions, you also do in orange, you also do have like your sub-dimensions that you can explore. And as a researcher or a practitioner, you don't necessarily need to go in to explore all of that, but you have the added advantage to say, if you are looking at a particular indicator, then there's room for you to cover as much as you can. Just giving an example for what we've done in Malawi. So when we started implementing GALS, and this is how we shaped, or this is what shaped and influenced us to rethink GALS as a research tool. We started in 2024 under one of the CGIR initiatives, and we were doing this within the southern and central parts of Malawi. We worked across 6 districts, and our target was really to get to 4,000 communities, where they get a sense of GALS around climate smart agriculture, specifically mechanization and conservation agricultural practices. We already had some of the barriers that were coming through from past projects, where we understood that adoption was really not happening. And we had to go in with GALS as an approach to understand why adoption was not happening at the scale that was expected. And so when we use GALS, to us, it was really just to create, safe spaces for households to be able to share visions, what they want to adopt, maybe irrigation as a practice, conservation agriculture as a practice. But we really had to emphasize, that participatory visioning approach in order to be able to ensure that gender issues or dynamics are coming out strongly. And so we followed this approach, had participants, and at the end of that process, we reached about 4,095 households in the communities. We started with a cascading approach where we identified GALS champions, and these champions were like 40. They became our training facilitators, and they were made up of traditional leaders, extension officers, lead farmers, and a couple of other farmers. We had them, train households who also became trainers, and they also later became community facilitators. And this took us to a number of 404. And each of these household members who had been trained had now the mandate to have participants that they trained directly. I think they were to train about 9 participants each. So in that process, we were able to get to 4,095. But when we came back last year to do an impact assessment, we now had a draft of this GALS for Gender Transformative Research. So it gave us an opportunity to use a robust Melia assessment tool, in this process of understanding change within sustainable adoption. And what we saw was that we went in and, we worked with 1,417 participants for the assessment and this came from the 4,095 communities with households we had worked with. And in this survey, we saw clear patterns emerging, right? We saw participants telling us that they were able to gain knowledge in their vision, journey, and goal setting. But the highest participants came from, the ability to use GALS as a methodology to translate that into why they should be adopting. And one of that came through why they needed to adopt manure application and tree planting as a sustainable practice. We also saw that there was increase in women's participation and leadership. And what we got from this process was that sustained engagement throughout the GALS process, and post-training follow-up, where participants were able to, across the different communities, create WhatsApp groups, bringing in the researchers into their WhatsApp groups, to share what they were learning and how they were also sharing the knowledge. So we saw that post-training diffusion, increased adoption of climate smart practices along with the GALS approach, which we had introduced as a transformative methodology. And so for us, this process helped us to really refine the GALS tool you currently have, because we also learned from what we had picked in the field last year, and it helped us to finalize the GALS tool. But what are the key takeaways we saw from this implementation process? We saw that research and transformation could easily lead to scaling. But we also saw that participatory process, from the word go, bringing communities into the research design process would also strengthen ownership and sustainability. But also what we pick from this is how we measure change, would give us clarity as to where transformation is happening. Is it at the level of agency, power, norms, institutional change? And so GALS, because it was, seamlessly integrated within our research design, we've been able to easily track, transformative change that is happening, but also now the scaling potential of this is higher. And so we've moved from Malawi and now currently rolling out this approach, GALS, in 2 other projects in Zambia, and looking forward to doing similar in Morocco towards end of this year. We also see that it addresses, critical gaps around participation, power dynamics, but also it brings in a strong monitoring and evaluation component, which often, was not really considered within the traditional GALS methodology. What we are also seeing is that the current tool now would allow you, measure meaningful gender transformation through a participatory approach, but implementation would require, genuine commitment from the research practitioners to saying we want communities to be a part of this process. This way you build trust with community members, knowledge diffusion is highly increased, but also you get academic rigor and expertise, in this research process, because the evidence that you generate can be backed with clear theoretical and conceptual framings. So I'm going to stop here, and hand over to Millicent, who is going to take us through comments and questions from participants joining us today. Unfortunately, I can't see my screen, so yes, I'm going to hand over and rely on Millicent and the team to coordinate the process. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ojong. Thank you so much for such a great presentation. And also for Tina for setting up the scene about providing your reflections around the roadblocks that you've encountered in terms of using this methodology. And of course, for Kathy for setting out the pace about this methodology. And Kathy, I know she has experience using this tool, and from her insights about sharing how she's been able to implement this within the Zambian context. So thank you so much, Ojong. Maybe a round of applause to Ojong before we go to the questions. Thank you. So there's quite a number of questions in the retro box, and if you still have questions and maybe you're having difficulties with using the Easy Retro board, you can still put your questions in the chat. And also, if you can, feel free to also raise up your hand. You use the button in the React buttons for you to raise your hand. So I will go directly to the questions. Some of the key questions, I know some of them have already been answered. And to Ojong, and I will say it's Ojong and the team. So the first question is asking, what is your experience of donor or funders' attitude towards this method and the context and or cultural specificity of working with gender and power? So maybe I will pose like 2 questions and then we could respond. I see more are coming. So maybe 3 questions and then we can respond as we move in. So besides that, there's a question about what are some of the specific facilitated methods or activities or even questions that you use to help communities and households explore power dynamics in a healthy and transformative way. And then the third question is more, how do you work with communities to ensure that any transformative change that occurs is sustainable over long term as relationship dynamics change over time? So I think I'll first pose those 3 questions. Over to Ojong.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. And yeah, we have a full team here, also willing to come in and respond to some of the questions. Let me start with the first one around maybe donors' perception around methodologies like this. I would say we need to be honest, right? Most donors generally do not really prioritize GESI tools or methods, right? But I must say, I've seen a couple of organizations, now pushing to say, as we, especially for donors, to say, as a donor, can you tell us clearly what your GESI priorities are? And in that space, donors are also now thinking, if we should have GESI priorities, what are those methods and tools that we should be looking out for, right? That can guide us in assessing those we fund or those we support. And to be honest, we do have a couple of organizations. I would say IFAD is really doing a lot of work, using GALS as a methodology. And you can tell from some of the stories that come out in their different contexts where GALS is being applied, that donors are also picking interest, in some of these methodologies, because now they get an understanding to say impact is not just reported from a perception or a position of us researchers saying, here's what we see impact, because often we go in without really defining impact for who, and for what. But now that's where the co-design process comes in, and that's where we are pushing for GALS to be seen as a research tool, because when you're able to define to a donor that the impact we are generating is coming, or it was a co-design process by communities who say the impact is this and it looks like this for us, or transformation looks like this for us, then a donor is willing to sponsor or fund, projects that align or bring GESI methods and tools into consideration. I don't know if other colleagues would want to come in and add to that. Yeah.
Thanks, Ojong. I just want to add a little bit from my country. Actually, this year, there's also, I'm based in Malaysia. There's actually our government policy. They started to put it in their, what they call it, the National Social Development Plan. It's actually, they actually want to focus more on GESI, looking into agriculture. So in the first, we thought that, hey, maybe this is not something relevant to us as a researcher or development practitioner. But this is actually now coming on board, slowly gaining traction, even at the government level, to ensure that, when we work with the community in agriculture, there must be a gender element. But at the same time, for funder, because my own organization, we receive local fund as well as UN development, UN fund. So they're very precise with the indicator. They want to see impact. So I do concur with Ojong. What is important is, as much we send the proposal, at the end of the day, they would like to see where the impact goes to, the indicator. How do you measure success? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tina and Ojong. So I will go to the other question. The question is, as an action researcher and facilitator, I often struggle when it comes to indicators or markers of change. Often the indicators shared by the community women are more towards their practical needs rather than their strategic needs. And this makes it really difficult for me to identify the indicators that come under gender transformative change. How can I approach these differently?
Yeah, I think I can take that. And just to also put it, maybe I should have said this in the presentation. When we go into the community co-designing the indicators, we often don't use some of the words you see here. I wouldn't say it's agency. Typically, we would have, words that are familiar to the participants, but we know, agency is what this is referring to. An example I would give is when we went into the community to start the indicator co-design process, this didn't even come out as the first thing. I think what came out from the communities was that what's even the standard? Like, what's the rule of law? Like, interventions coming every day from different organizations, right? How do we even hold ourselves and the communities and the development practitioners accountable? What's the ethics? How is data being shared? You know, these questions started coming up, and it got us to start thinking, are we only here to co-design indicators that can help us track change, or should we also start by looking at some ethical guiding principles? And so like Kathy and the team, we are now already looking at that to say, before we go into communities, can we co-design a process where community starts by understanding what are some of the standard ethical guiding principles that is guiding that research process? Because that way, some of the indicators that will come later, you know, in terms of measuring change, is already now embedded within an ethical approach or principle. But just to say, we have also developed, and I can share that with the team, and to you all, we've developed indicators when we did for conservation agriculture. We've developed a full survey that gives you a breakdown for each of the MILIA indicators. And what we've done is we grounded this within the Rich, Benefit, Empower, Transform framework. You know, so it makes it easier for you to say, when I'm here doing MILIA, you know, or learning, for example, what are those sub-indicators I should be looking at from a rich perspective, from a benefit perspective, from an empowerment perspective, from a transformation perspective? You know, we've done that for each of the steps, from monitoring, evaluation, learning, impact assessment, and adjustment. So it's such a robust and very in-depth survey that if you choose to do only a particular aspect, you already have so many indicators that you don't need to think about what to do. But again, this can be tailored to your context, but also the intervention that you have at hand. But yeah, it's something we are open to share. And also, if you look at our publications, I think I'm also going to put the link here on creating safe spaces, what we did in Malawi. You would see that those indicators were used, and you can also just follow something similar.
So, John, so just the last one, maybe just in 30 seconds. I know we are running out of time. Just combining two more questions. Just maybe in your experience using this methodology in Malawi.
Sorry, I'm gonna interrupt because I'm just saying there's just 2 minutes left. And some people may have a hard stop, and we want to just make sure that they know about the next one. So I'd like to make the suggestion that when we do have a recording of this, and we're going to send the recording to all participants, and we'll write down the answers to those remaining questions so that we can give them full justice rather than just having a very quick response. So sorry to interrupt you, Millicent. I hope that's okay with everybody.
No, it makes sense.
So
it makes sense. We'll address all the questions.
I think we could talk about this. We could talk about this for hours, I think, if not days. So we would like to invite you, if any of you participants here today, if you think maybe you would be curious to try out GALS for Gender Transformative Research, we have shared the links with you. You can have a look at GALS if you weren't familiar with that already, and then have a look at GALS4GTR. And in the written up practice document, you have all the steps, you have the timing, you have the roles that are needed, you have the materials that are needed. It's quite comprehensive. And if you think you'd like to give it a go in your own research or development practice, then please consider joining a small learning group that we'd like to set up so that people trying out this research tool can adopt it, adapt it to their own contexts, and then share with each other what they found useful. Maybe you find a shortcut, maybe you expand something, maybe you encounter a unique challenge in your context that you want to share with others, and maybe get other people's ideas on how to address that challenge. There's so much that we can learn from each other. So if you'd like to join that group, you can do that using the QR code on the screen. And then also, if not done already, if somebody could drop that link also into the chat for people who prefer just to do it with the chat. Finally, I think there should just be one last slide to tell you about the next tool that we're going to be introducing to everybody, which will be on, let me just scroll through at least my things. We want to look at how to integrate a gender transformative lens into the delivery of climate information services. So if you're doing climate information services in your work, or your colleagues are delivering climate information services, and you want to have some thinking about integrating a gender transformative lens into that, then on Thursday, the 25th of June, at 3 o'clock Central European Summertime, we will be introducing a gender transformative adaptation of the approach called PICSA, the Participatory Integrated Climate Services for Agriculture approach. So come along to that one as well, and let's keep all this learning going as we go ahead. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. It's been incredibly rich. Thank you, Ojong and Tina and Millicent and Kathy and Jessica for putting on such a fantastic session. Absolutely. You know, what a way to start the toolkit deep dives. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.